Good evening, thank you so much. I apologise in advance that this is going to be in English and not in French. My spoken French is really not up to scratch. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me here. Jean-Francois has given you a rundown of what my research is about and what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. Some of this is still in its fairly early stages. I am picking away at different islands within what I call the archipelago. I increasingly describe myself really as a historian of the periphery, and I do that because, well, what is periphery to one person is central to someone else. And tonight I am talking about James VI and First and his so-called Empire of Islands. I'm not sure how much James VI and First needs in terms of an introduction. He was King of Scotland for 18 years before he inherited the thrones of England and Ireland. Also, I'm often at pains to point out, many people forget that he was King of 3 instead of focusing on just 2 kingdoms. Since the turn of the century, we have seen a number of key publications on James. In 2000, there was Goodyear and Lynch's The Reign of James VI. We have Ralph Holbrook's book. We have Michael Young and Conrad Russell's James VI and his English Parliaments. We've had a number of edited volumes, and most recently, Jenny Wormald's various essays on James have been reprinted and published, along with Stephen Reed's book that came out last year, which largely focused on James's minority. I list all this just really to outline the ongoing interest in James, a king in Scotland who really needs no introduction. Our understanding of James has come a long way over the last half decade. It was Jenny Wormald, when she first studied James, who was trying to really assert how effective he was as a monarch, given the views of English historians of him. Indeed, she questioned, why is it that James I is remembered not as the patron of Ben Jonson, John Donne, Inigo Jones and Shakespeare, but the slobbering drunkard who presided over a debauched court? And that stems really from how English and Scottish historians have viewed him. Scottish historians see him as King of Scotland for 18 years before he achieved that century-long Stuart ambition of realising this British Empire. English historians tend to view him as he was just a Scot who inherited the throne and didn't really do a very good job of managing his English parliaments. So you get these two very conflicting historiographies. Jenny spent a long time trying to set out just why those 18 years of James's experience of ruling Scotland was really beneficial for his reign after 1603. She said James presided over a kingdom probably more stable than his predecessor had left, and certainly than his successor was to rule. And Jenny spent much of her career really expanding on that and seeking to really rescue James's reputation, both in Scotland and in England, evidencing just what an effective ruler he was. And sometimes I think almost we've gone too far. Today, most Scottish historians will agree that James is a very good thing, right? He's a great king. Very few people will criticise him. I sometimes think we cut James an awful lot of slack, and we don't do that for Charles, right? We all put all the blame onto Charles. I'm often at points to point out to my students that one of James's greatest achievements was that he lived a long time, like he didn't die young. If you look at the 16th century, James IV, James V, Mary Queen of Scots was deposed, didn't die. Mary of Guise, all of them had their reigns cut short, and so there was a long period. There were long periods of minorities during the 16th century. James survived. And because of that, he was able to implement policies and see them through for a considerable period of time. He was able to do much more in terms of governance. The general consensus is then that by the time he went south in 1603, he had tamed the overmighty nobility, he had clawed back control of the church, and had pacified the Highlands. I don't agree with any of those statements. I don't think they're all absolutely true, but he was making progress in all of those areas. But ruling as an absentee monarch when he went to London created difficulties. To be fair, largely he navigated them quite well. I'm skipping, those are some of his works that he published. James wrote extensively, as you know. Some of them really interesting: Basilic and Doran, True Law, Free Monarchies. Great. Demonology, perhaps not so much, but we'll move on from that. He wasn't always successful, but his task navigating being king of 3 separate kingdoms wasn't easy. I think too often we forget that in 1603 it was a union of the crowns. It was no more and no less than that. He ruled 3 separate kingdoms. The historiography, however, post-1603 continues to be overwhelmingly focused on Scotland and England, despite the fact that one of the first things he did as king was to grant extensive lands to Randall MacDonald in Antrim in the north of Ireland. James also inherited a fairly empty English royal purse thanks to the long war with Spain, which he also ended in 1604. It was a deeply unpopular peace in England. He also had seen the end of war in Ireland. It had come to an end shortly before Elizabeth died. No doubt, as a Scottish king, inheriting 2 additional separate kingdoms was going to be complicated given the relationship between all 3. But I think what we forget is that after 1603, he was more than just king of 3 kingdoms. He also ruled over various dominions and territories, and that's what I refer to his empire of islands. It's really hard to get a map that incorporates Orkney and Shetland in the north and the Channel Islands in the south and the rest of it. Okay, most maps will cut off one or other of those bits. James certainly saw himself as an imperial monarch, and throughout the 16th century the Stuart monarchs had utilised that language and iconography of imperial monarchy. What that meant was that he was the ultimate source of authority, both spiritual and temporal, within his realm. It's why in 1533 Henry VIII would declare this realm of England as an empire. No, Henry still had Calais, and the English, as you know, were always happy to assert lingering claims to France, despite not having much grounds for that. That's not what Henry was talking about. He was making it clear, especially to the Pope, that he was the ultimate source of jurisdiction within his kingdom, and thus followed the break with Rome and everything that came after that. As King of Scotland, James also asserted that language of imperial kingship. But now, post-1603, he did rule over something that becomes more akin to what our understanding of empire was. It's not just that you're the ultimate source of authority within a defined border, you are also ruler of an aggregate of territories and dominions. And post-1607, that also included Jamestown in Virginia. I'm not going there this evening, I'm focusing on the archipelago on this side of the Atlantic. Now, such views of James as an imperial monarch are also kind of compounded by and sit alongside the recent trend for studies of state formation. I struggle with this an awful lot. I'm very open to that. I find theories about processes of state formation and arguments about them quite difficult, partly because often we don't define what we mean by state formation. There's a tendency to focus on crown and government and the exercise of power, accompanied by arguments to suggest moves towards increased centralisation and uniformity. Medievalist historians have pointed out, with reference to that vast landed empire of the Plantagenets, that centralisation and uniformity do not necessarily go hand in hand, while the observation of J.H. Eliot in regards to composite monarchies in Europe mean that to some extent the state formation, I think, is now largely understood as the efforts by Crown and government to enhance its authority at both national and international level. But there's an ongoing tendency, and certainly within Scottish history, and I would say within British history as well, that kind of centre-periphery framework, and it prioritises the centre and marginalises the role of individuals and communities at that so-called periphery. And that centre-periphery framework really presents a view of governance as something that's that's formulated at the centre and then imposed onto periphery. My last book really engaged with that and tried to explore that process of governance as a dialogue, right? Not just between centre and periphery, but between various centres, as opposed to a two-way. It is a dialogue amongst multiple groupings. All that said, what I want to do tonight is explore James's efforts to govern this so-called empire of islands. As I said, my current research, some of it still in fairly early stages, examines these various island dominions within James's empire, specifically Orkney and Shetland in the North Sea, the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea, and the Channel Islands just off the Normandy coast. I explore the local situations in each of these areas, but also where they fit into that wider empire, and to what extent James tries to impose any kind of central governance over these parts of his realm. Tonight I'm going to look primarily at his policies towards the Channel Islands, largely because I thought that might be of more interest to this audience, but I am going to highlight similarities and differences with Orkney and Shetland, those islands in the very north of his realm, and suggest that far from centralisation and uniformity, James's processes of state formation saw a willingness to encourage divergence and difference throughout his kingdoms, territories and dominions. Not all the time, but sometimes. As Mark Greengrass pointed out, the approach which concentrates exclusively on state building from the centre misses the crucial dimension of awareness of the caution with which rulers dealt with deeply ingrained regional identities and differences. And I would argue that in both the Channel Islands and also Orkney and Shetland, you see those deeply ingrained regional differences and identities. And James, I think, dealt with each of these island groupings differently in some ways and similarly in other respects. The Channel Islands have been part of the Duchy of Normandy when, in 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, conquered England, and then they became part of the territories of the English crown. Between 1204 and 1217, Philip II of France seized the mainland territories from King John, including the Duchy of Normandy. Most histories simply state that John then retained possession of the Channel Islands, which he did, but it was something of a struggle. The position of the Channel Islands remained in flux during the first couple of decades of the 13th century. Ultimately, the islanders remained loyal to their Plantagenet monarchs, but it was not until the Treaty of Paris in 1259 that Henry III of England formally acknowledged the Plantagenet continental losses and ceased to be Duke of Normandy, but he simultaneously retained possession of the Channel Islands, which Philip then formally renounced. Nonetheless, the separation of the islands from Normandy could not but bring changes, and steps were taken to secure government over the islands, while also preserving customary laws and judicial institutions. Over the following centuries, apart from occasional episodes where the French attacked or occupied parts of the islands, they remained under the jurisdiction of the English monarchy. And that confused and kind of history that remained in flux for some time shaped politics, law and custom on the islands. No doubt because the Channel Islands remained under the jurisdiction of the English crown, history has been written as if that were mostly the case throughout the medieval period. But Tim Thornton has shown that allegiances, whether political or confessional, and identities, whether Norman, French or simply islander, they never really saw themselves as English, it has been argued. All of that was very much in flux for some time. The islanders expressed an allegiance to the English king, but their linguistic, their ecclesiastic, their legal, their cultural ties with Normandy remained strong. And that's understandable given their geographic position. And there was constant and fairly easy movement of people between the islanders and France. It was because of the closeness of the ties to Normandy that the islanders' ancient customs and privileges were maintained and protected by an English monarchy that was very, very keen to ensure their continued possession of their so-called French islands. And over time, English monarchs reaffirmed these traditional customs and privileges of the islanders. And those privileges included freedom from taxation and customs on imported goods, being treated as subjects of the English crown, not as aliens, and perhaps most importantly, the island's neutrality in times of warfare. In economic terms, those were most vital for the merchants and the inhabitants of the islands. As I said, those privileges were renewed time and time again and were reaffirmed by Elizabeth during her reign, by which time those privileges are regarded, and you see this phrase coming up time and time again in the sources, they were existed as beyond what the memory of man can reach. And you see that repeated a lot. The advantages were obvious. It protected the islands from invasion. The profits of trade would not be disrupted by war. The provision of work for English merchants and seamen was protected. And also, it was the importance of intelligence that the islanders might gain that the English crown really benefited and tried to protect as well. During her reign, or during Elizabeth's reign, we also see the expansion and confirmation of the legal jurisdiction within the Channel Islands. And it's really what I want to talk about for the next while. And Elizabeth really confirmed that legal jurisdiction lay in the islands and with the islands' ruling elite. Now, the ruling elite on the islands consisted of a crown-appointed captain or governor. Governor was his title, along with the bailiff and jurates, and they were local men. They were from local families. The jurates were local judges chosen by the islanders and confirmed by the governor. The bailiff was chosen by the governor, but he had to have knowledge and understanding of the island's laws, liberties and customs, and so he was very much at the interface between the islanders themselves and the governor as the crown's representative. Following a number of grievances submitted by the inhabitants of the islands to the crown in the 1560s, Elizabeth made it really clear that legal cases were to be tried in the islands. Only on very rare occasions did she allow anything to be kicked back to the Privy Council in London. It was like she really didn't want to touch it. She just kept pushing it back, saying, no, 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 you try all this by the island's laws. But what you see, I think, during Elizabeth's reign is ongoing opposition on the part of the islanders to those crown-appointed governors who were sent over from England, and their willingness really to challenge his authority within the islands. And that really comes to the fore, that struggle between what I call an increasingly articulate island community and those crown-appointed officials really is what you see in the reign of James VI and First. It's been argued that when James did become King of England and Ireland as well in 1603, that as far as the Channel Islands were concerned, he really didn't do very much. He just kind of sat back. I don't really agree, but I'll come to that later. The first move he did make in relation to the islands was to remove Sir Walter Raleigh, who was then governor of Jersey in 1603. James just didn't like Walter Raleigh. We don't need to go into the details. I think his opinion of him had been coloured by individuals who surrounded him. Anyway, he just didn't like Raleigh, removed him and imprisoned him in the Tower, but therefore needed to find a new governor of Jersey. And as usual, James looks to what you see in, I apologise, I always do this, but run with me. I talk about the peripheries. James moves people with experience of governing in the peripheries around those peripheries. For example, he takes Andrew Knox, who was Bishop of the Isles in Scotland, and sends him out to the far west of Ireland. He takes Sir John Petton, who had served in Ireland, to replace Raleigh in the Channel Islands. You see him moving these individuals around. So he turns to Sir John Petton. Petton, perhaps as a crown-appointed governor of the islands, is perhaps unsurprisingly very defensive of royal right, and very soon was in dispute with the islanders. A few years later, the local man John Herrell was appointed as bailiff and therefore represents the islanders. He was from the parish of St Saviour, and a real dispute broke out between these two men. Herrell, the bailiff, the local, advocated greater power and independence for the islands. Clash with Petton, the crown-appointed governor sent over from England. The conflict between the two men was articulated in terms of who had superiority, whether that was Petton as governor or Harold as bailiff. Bailiff argued he had preeminence over the governor because he regarded the governor as purely a military figure. Petton protested on the grounds that his letters of patent gave him the right to appoint the bailiff. So you get this struggle, okay? I'm going to spare you the details of that struggle. It continues for some time, but it's interesting to look at how it is articulated by those who are kind of, if you like, on the crown side, those crown appointed governors. When the governor of Guernsey, Sir Thomas Layton, died in 1610, and Layton had the islanders complain about him for decades, that the litany of complaints against him was quite extensive. When he died, he was replaced by Sir George Carew. Carew had been a really brutal president of Munster in Ireland during the 1590s and 1610s. He had quite literally just slaughtered people quite extensively in Ireland, as what happened. He'd also been sent to carry out a survey of the Ulster plantation. He was sent to Guernsey. I should qualify that. He was appointed governor of Guernsey. He was very rarely there. But he wrote to Sir Thomas Egerton, Lord Viscount Brackley, Lord Chancellor of England, regarding this dispute between Petton and Harrow in Jersey. I apologise in advance, this is a really long quote, but I think it's worth it. Just in terms of the language of how those from the so-called centre talk about those at the so-called periphery. Carew wrote of the arrogant behaviour of Harold, who aims at nothing else but to suppress the authority of the governor and make him no better than an under-officer to the baillie. He went on to outline the dangers which will ensue if Harold attempts prevail. It is not unknown to your lordship that the islands of Guernsey and Jersey are parcels of the dukedom of Normandy, the inhabitants by ancient descent natural Normans, their civil government managed by the customary law of Normandy, the ecclesiastic according to the French reformed discipline. Their trade is most with Normandy. There they marry and send their daughters to be married. The Normans there are ordinary servants, whereby it may be concluded that in blood, commerce and affection they are no less Normans than when they had a particular duke. Nevertheless, I do hold them to be good subjects to the Crown of England, and so I hope they will ever continue, induced thereunto by large charters, privileges and immunities, by which from time to time they have been granted by the Kings of England, whereby they live in more freedom than any subjects in Europe. Questionable. But in affection they are still Normans, and there is no doubt to be made, the state of these islands standing as it doth, how unfit it is to put all power into the hands of the bailiffs, who must be and are natives of the islands, is apparent. If Harold prevail, we that are governors shall be discouraged and disabled to perform the duties our place require, and the safety of the islands must rest only in the good dispositions of the bailiff's natives, which, how they may be effective, God knows. Such attitudes were reiterated in reports sent both to the King and the Lord Chancellor recounting the affairs of Jersey. They spoke of the dangerous ambition in him, Harold, a native, which may in time confirm in the people a conceit of the small use of His Majesty's English governors in those parts. They shall see that his, the governor's, just authority eclipsed by the assumed power of any native. They and divers others, his attempts and usurpations, are most dangerous in a frontier place so remote from the eye of the state, so near to the defective Duchy of Normandy, whereof it was sometimes a member, especially considering he is a native of so presumptuous and daring spirit, whose fidelity is cautionable by nothing but his person. There are clear similarities in terms of the language used, and you see it also in the Irish context. Understandable given Carew's previous Irish experience. I mentioned his tendency to kill a lot of Irish, which he did, but he refers to the natives who are dangerous, presumptuous and daring in spirit. Their fidelity is cautionable. It is unfit to put all power into the hands of natives of the islands, and the islands are but a frontier place remote from the eye of the state. I'm going to leave the Channel Islands there. I'll come back to them shortly. But that governance of an attitude towards the Channel Islands has aspects that are similar to that compared with Orkney and Shetland. Now, these Northern Isles had come under Scottish jurisdiction much more recently, only in the 15th century via the betrothal and marriage of James III of Scotland to Margaret, the daughter of Christian I of Denmark-Norway. It occurred in 1468-9. That marriage also saw the cancelling of the debt of taxation that Scotland owed Denmark for the Hebrides and the Isle of Man. And it saw the islands of Orkney and Shetland mortgaged to the Scottish Crown. We tend to think that at that point, Orkney and Shetland simply become part of the Scottish kingdom. We talk about this is when Scotland reached its full territorial extent. That's really up for debate. The Norwegian Crown retained the right to redeem those islands any time on a payment of money. And several times throughout the 16th century, there is negotiation between mostly governors during a royal minority and Norway, Denmark, Norway, about the return of the islands. That never happens, largely, I think, because Denmark, Norway, they go through civil war, and the crown is often with Denmark rather than Norway, and so there isn't the same desire to redeem the islands. Norway sees the islands as part of its kingdom. The Danes, not quite so bothered about that. And then civil war intervenes, and for various reasons the islands are never redeemed, and so they remain with the Scottish kingdom. That ongoing relationship I'm still unpicking, but up until the late 17th century, monarchs of Denmark, Norway, in their coronation charters, there's still the obligation to redeem the islands. The monarchies of Denmark, Norway is both hereditary and elective, but they have a coronation charter and they're meant to sign up to all these conditions that they will then fulfill as monarch. And there's that constant repeat that we will redeem the islands, and they never do. Sorry, I'm going to stop there. I went down a rabbit hole. I'll bring it back. So it's late 15th century, the islands become part of the Scottish kingdom. Scottish monarchs don't really interfere very much in the islands. They're interested in them. James V gets very excited about Orkney at some point in the 1540s, I think largely to do with the fishing that goes on there. By the time James VI begins his personal rule, his uncle Robert, who is the half-brother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and one of James V's illegitimate sons, he was Earl of Orkney. Robert had been in the islands from the late 1560s, and in the 1570s had faced multiple allegations of abuse and oppressions from the islanders. The allegations in Orkney, to be fair, stemmed largely from his opponents. The complaints in Shetland were aimed largely at Robert's half-brother, Lawrence Bruce of Kilmaldy, who was Robert's senior froud or senior legal official in the island. That's not to say Robert is innocent of any of the allegations that were put to him, but many of them were stirred up by his enemies or people who opposed his position. Robert manages to escape any attempts by the Crown to bring him to court to answer the charges levelled, and in 1581 is created Earl of Orkney and Lord of Shetland by James. Robert's troubles don't end. Quite simply, he has amassed too many enemies in Orkney by this time, while also becoming largely impoverished. He dies in 1593 and is succeeded by his son Patrick. Patrick had been created Lord of Shetland in 1590, manages to get the title Earl of Orkney only in 1600. James was a little bit reluctant to create him Earl until that time. By this time, Patrick too has amassed a significant amount of opposition within the islands himself. Other members of the Scottish lesser nobility and the islanders themselves really disagreed with his governance of the islands. He tries to resolve some of these issues, but Patrick continues to live a rather extravagant lifestyle, including embarking on an impressive building programme which came at the expense of his island tenants and subjects, and also investment of his own resources. Ongoing complaints about his actions reached the ear of James, who becomes increasingly frustrated by his cousin. James writes to him several times and tells him, you've got to stop behaving in this way, you've got to start addressing the complaints of your island subjects, and Patrick really doesn't do very much. James finally takes action, imprisons him in Edinburgh Castle, but still tries to reach agreement with him. Patrick's illegitimate son, called Robert, breaks out in rebellion in the islands of Orkney and tries to take over the Earl's palaces, both at Bursey, right, and in Kirkwall. It's eventually, Patrick is executed by the Maiden at the Market Cross in 1615. Patrick is said to have cast a long shadow of the Northern Isles. His reputation is that of misrule and evil. Brian Smith has dealt well with the reputations of both Patrick and his father, arguing that they were far from perfect, but perhaps not as awful as they have been portrayed. But the castles behind me, I got to Orkney last summer for the second time. These are ruins now, but they are really impressive, for Scottish terms, forms of Renaissance architecture, especially the palace in Kirkwall, in comparison to other Scottish castles. And I still don't really understand how they can afford to do it. Orkney and Shetland, if you look at the rentals, everything written about them, these are not wealthy islands, okay? There's not a lot of money. And the Earls, while they may have invested their own resources, they are not that wealthy either. So their building projects is something I'm still trying to understand, because these are, as I said in Scottish terms, really impressive castles. Anyway, James, by the end of the first decade of the 17th century, has removed, if you like, the crown-appointed officials from Orkney and Shetland, is going to have to find some other way of dealing with these islands. And in that sense, there are similar struggles between the Earls of Orkney and the local inhabitants of the islands. Indeed, the inhabitants had levelled complaints about Earl Robert and his son Earl Patrick on various occasions. They had always managed to escape punishment. After Patrick had been warded in Edinburgh Castle, the Privy Council in Edinburgh issued a proclamation in favour of the poor subjects of Orkney and Shetland concerning the miserable tyranny and oppression which they have sustained and underlie under the usurped authority of Patrick, Earl of Orkney. They talk about Patrick again as having abused the king's power and jurisdiction. He had gone beyond the bounds of his duty. He had cloaked his violent and insolent proceedings with the pretext of law and justice. And so James, out of his fatherly care for his good subjects and his concern that the islanders might live in peace and quietness, was removing Patrick from his position. So much like the Channel Islands, where there is significant disagreement between that crown-appointed governor and the inhabitants, you see something similar in Orkney and Shetland. Indeed, I mentioned previously the numerous allegations levelled against Thomas Layton, the governor of Jersey, that were looked into. And you can see similarities between the complaints issued against Robert and Patrick in Orkney and Shetland. And again, you see the similar language in relation to what is used in Ireland at the same time, the continual reference to the oppression of overlords, the oppression of the people by their overlords, the tyrannical use of power over those, if you like, the ordinary tenants on the ground. I'm just going to run through some of the allegations to give you a sense of what we see, the concerns issued by the local inhabitants against the Crown-appointed officials, if you like, both in Jersey and Guernsey and in the Channel Islands. In the Channel Islands, the complaints you get are the usurping the authority of the bailiff and jurates to establish a martial jurisdiction, forbidding the islanders to travel outside the Isles without his position, to take beer and wood at whatever price he demanded, to restrain the people of the Isles from assisting any foreign ship if in trouble, and yet ordering mariners to go against pirates to the danger of their own persons. They had ordered expensive fortifications in the Isles and imposed customs on foreign goods, customs that they had always not been allowed to impose. And there was lots of concerns about their right to dry wreck or seaweed on their rocks. In Orkney, the complaints were bringing in new laws forged or evolved from the laws of Orkney, but never formally used. Sorry, laws evolved from the laws of Norway, but never formally used in Orkney. Taking up the king's customs and tolls, but not those contained in the charters, compelling the fishermen to grant heavy taxes, usurping the office of admiralty, imprisoning the king's officer, imposing new taxes and payments, etc., etc. The complaints are long, but sometimes there's real similarities. It's about that extension of power over and beyond what is allowed. In the Channel Islands, the dispute between Petton and Herald dragged on. A commission was finally appointed in 1615 to decide on the matter. It wasn't until following a royal commission that actually the bailiff was granted precedence over the governor in courts, and such they are upholding the rights of the local governing authorities. In other words, James continued and was willing to allow the islanders to use their own laws and customs, and sort of upheld the role of the local officials. Situation in Orkney and Shetland is really rather different. He hears all the complaints issued by the islanders, fine. He takes Patrick away, he's executed. He directs the new Bishop of Orkney to repair to the islands and to take inquiry and make a full report of what has happened. The bishop was given extensive jurisdiction to look into the affairs there, to restore peace, to take oaths of allegiance and supremacy, and generally restore the king's authority. The same day, an Act of Parliament forbade the use of foreign laws in the islands, declaring that all subjects of the kingdom should be governed by the laws thereof, etc., etc. In other words, Channel Islands, those ancient laws that have been used for centuries, are confirmed, are protected by James. Channel in Orkney and Shetland is completely different. They have remained under their customary laws since the islands come under Scottish jurisdiction. 1611, James extends the Got law to the islands. He imposes Scottish law over these islands. So he's dealing in legal terms, allowing the Channel Islands to continue with their customary laws. Orkney and Shetland, he's imposing Scots law over the islands. The reason for this divergence in central policy was not just because of two parliaments, one in London and one in England, one king ruling over both kingdoms. To my mind, this is about maritime matters and about what best suited the interests of James in the north and the south. I'm not going to say any more on that, so I'm going to skip over this. I'm not going to say any more on that. I can come back to that because I'm not going to go down a maritime. Sorry, this is Hugo Grotius. It's a map of Carta Marina of Scandinavia and salmon, because it's all about fishing. But I'm going to move on to talk about another policy to show where he does impose uniformity. So in legal terms, he's happy to have divergence across this island empire. But in terms of his religious policy, I think James is doing something very different. I've already mentioned Tim Thornton's work on the non-English territories of England, and he really emphasises the difference in terms of his regionalism rather than uniformity and centralisation. And I think it's really interesting, but Thornton is an English historian, and I think we get a different perspective if we bring the Scotland and Ireland into all of this. And certainly in his analysis of James's attitude towards the church in the Channel Islands, I tend to disagree. At the start of his reign, In 1603, James confirms the ecclesiastical settlement of the islands, and Thornton argues that there is no long-term agenda behind the appointment of the Anglican Petton to the post of Governor of Jersey, and suggests that James deliberately delayed any attempts to reform the ecclesiastical situation in the islands until the time was right. That may be the case, but I think it's more nuanced. I don't have the time to go into a detailed discussion of the church in the Channel Islands. And yes, it is the case that James doesn't do much at the outset of his reign. A.J. Eagleston has argued this is because the king initially approved of the religious situation in the islands. I really don't think so. The islands were still largely Presbyterian. They had remained under the Church of Coutances until 1568, and it was only in 1568 that they had been brought into the English Church and were brought into the Diocese of Winchester. So that Presbyterian form of church that existed in the islands, I don't think James was willing to allow to continue. He is not a fan of Presbyterianism, and we see that in Scotland and also in Ireland. He tolerates it because it's part of his contemporary acceptance of the situation in the Channel Islands. But also, I think it's more than that. The sense that James didn't do very much when he inherited the throne. James is kind of busy when he succeeds in 1603. He's got a lot on his plate. He is dealing with the fallout of the ending of the 9 Years' War in Ireland. He is dealing with another failed rebellion in Lewis, where he was undertaking plantation. He has become king of two new kingdoms. He's dealing with a steady stream of courtiers in London trying to ingratiate themselves with him. He's brought the end to the war with Spain. He's trying also to deal with the radical Presbyterian element within his church in Scotland. And so while the charters of April and December 1604 to Jersey and Guernsey respectively, which kind of confirm the situation, there's other reasons for his delay. And I think when it comes to church governance, we need to take a look at the wider, if you like, three kingdoms perspective. Because I think in Scotland, we get very focused on James's policy regarding the 5 Articles of Perth in 1617 to 18, and we talk about this is a Scottish king who's gone to England and comes back in 1617 to 18 and imposes this kind of change in religious worship, and he's lost a sense of Scottish customs and forms of worship. I just don't agree with that at all. I think we need to take a look at that wider archipelagic picture. And I'm just going to run through some of the things he's doing in his early reign so we get a sense of what's going on in the church. In 1605, he appoints George Montgomery, who's based in London at the time, to the sees of Derry, Raphoe and Clogher, all based in Donegal in Ireland. Montgomery was tasked with surveying the Catholic Church and making recommendations for how it might be turned into a Protestant Anglican establishment in Ireland. In 1606, he summons Andrew Melville and 7 Scottish Presbyterian ministers to London, and the following year imprisons Melville in the Tower. In 1610, James restores bishops and episcopacy within the church in Scotland. In 1613, he sends letters to both Jersey and Guernsey, informing them of his plan to introduce Anglicanism into the islands, though he does offer some cautious language, stating that this would be done as the opportunity offers. In 1616, he also wrote to his Scottish Privy Council, and I'm digressing slightly here because I love his form of words in this letter. He writes regarding the tender and princely love and regard he has for his native and ancient kingdom, a kingdom he hadn't returned to since 1603. And he mentions how these many years past he had a great and natural longing to see his native soil and place of birth and breeding. This was, according to James, a salmon-like instinct of the mind that so stirred up our thoughts and bends our desires to make a journey thither. James obviously knew something about salmon migratory patterns, and as I already mentioned, I think fishing occupied James's mind more than we've acknowledged. But I'm digressing here. He is talking about his desire to return to Scotland, which he does then the following year in 1617. He makes good that salmon-like instinct, returns to Scotland and brings about the 5 Articles of Perth, which caused quite a rupture in the Scottish Church, because they see this as not his attempt to reform it along Anglican lines, but his attempt to reintroduce Catholic forms of worship. In the same year, however, he appoints that commission to bring about that dispute between Petton and Herald in Jersey. And that commission reaches its decision, confirming, yes, the governor's overarching decision, but bolstering that of the bailiff and of the local customary legal practices. The following year, in 1618, the 5 Articles of Perth are passed by the General Assembly, albeit with a little intimidation and bribery on James's part. In other words, while he may have taken longer to reform the church in the Channel Islands, that has more to do with the wider archipelagic context. James is introducing a number of policies across his 3 kingdoms and across his various island dominions during that period. If James and Petton did collude in a delay about introducing Anglicanism into the islands, it was because James did have a long-term plan for the reform of the church in the islands. And I would argue that the appointment of Petton was exactly part of that plan. James was willing to allow divergence in some areas, allowing the ancient laws, customs and privileges of the Channel Islands to continue. His reign had brought peace with both France and Spain, and although the issue of neutrality of the islands in warfare became less pressing, James acknowledged that it remained on balance very beneficial. This was well established in both law and custom, and James absolutely had no desire to interfere. As with previous monarchs, James fully recognised that the benefits outweighed the negative repercussions of the possession of the islands. But in church affairs, the trend towards Presbyterianism in the islands was not going to be tolerated. And I think Thornton doesn't really grasp that, because he doesn't situate the Channel Islands within that wider archipelagic context. And while I struggle, as I said at the outset, with arguments about state formation and emphasis on centralisation and uniformity, it is important to acknowledge that when it occurs. I don't think we can counter a centre-orientated narrative by simply replacing it with a periphery-orientated narrative. And in matters of church government, I don't think James was prepared to tolerate such divergence. So what I try to do in my work is to stop taking that state or centre-orientated perspective and perhaps also disentangle it from state formation arguments, but to consider where James is able and willing to consider divergence in some areas and in some regions, but elsewhere actually want to bring about uniformity, again in different regions across that wider archipelago. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Press the stop. Yes, the stop button.